So I'm Marie-Josée Kravis, the chair of the Economic Club, and welcome to everyone here today to our 502nd Economic Club meeting. And I'd like to especially thank the 280 members of the Centennial Society. Many of you are here at the front of the room. And thank you for ensuring the stability and growth of the club. Your contributions really are the lifeblood of the club, and I thank you. And I also welcome our 2019 class of fellows. Now, I'm very happy today to welcome David Rubenstein, who's the chair of the Economic Club of Washington, so a club with whom we have reciprocal arrangements. But David is really hard to introduce. He himself, in his rather inimitable, self-deprecating way, has explained that his mother wanted him to be a dentist, but he went to law school. After graduating from Duke University, went to Chicago Law School, was the editor of the Law Review, joined Paul Weiss, a prestigious law firm, but left not really happy with his lot there. And a little, I think, surprised that his partners didn't try, or the partners, he wasn't a partner at the time, didn't try to hold him back. But he left and went to Washington, was counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Constitutional Amendments, then became deputy assistant to President Carter for domestic policy. And David claims that he had a big role in bringing the inflation rate to 19%. He then became a lawyer again, but finally in 1987 decided to build on his knowledge of Washington and the corporate world, and he founded the Carlyle Group, which of course became one of the country's leading investment firms and now has assets of over $210 billion. But he didn't only do that. He also became very involved in the not-for-profit world. He currently chairs the Board of Trustees of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Smithsonian Institution, the Council on Foreign Relations, and he sits on a number of other not-for-profit boards, the University of Chicago, Memorial Sloan Kettering, Johns Hopkins Medical Center, Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and the World Economic Forum, and that's only naming a few. At one time, David was running 8 major capital campaigns across the country, so his commitment to philanthropy is a very deep commitment. David will begin a conversation with Glenn Hutchins, who is the vice chair of the Economic Club and also chairman of North Island, Glenn Hutchins, and will be on the other side of the interview process. David is very well known with his interviews and will now be answering questions instead of asking them. So I ask Glenn and David to please join us and remind everyone that the meeting is on the record. And please
thank you.
Entertain us.
Thank you, Marie-Josée, and thank you for everything you do for the club. It's terrific. David, thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
David has an announcement he'd like to make. He intends to announce today at the club that he's going to be a candidate for President of the United States. And David, would you like to fill us in on that news of the morning? Well, this is on the record, of course. So,
it's embarrassing to be the only person I know not running for the Democratic nomination. I no longer can find anybody to have dinner with because everybody's running for president. So I decided that maybe I would join them all and run on the carried interest ticket. But I'm not sure that would probably appeal to that many people in Iowa or elsewhere. So I think I'll stay where I am, actually.
So David, thank you. We'll come back to later. Maybe by the end of the night, at the lunchtime, we can persuade him differently, but we'll come back to that. David, you grew up in Baltimore, everyone knows. Your father was a postman, is that right?
My father worked in the post office. He had dropped out of high school to go into World War II. He came back, he met my mother, they got married not that long thereafter, and the only job he really was qualified for, he didn't go back to high school or college, was a job that didn't require those degrees, and so he worked in the post office his entire career.
So what about your formative years in that community in Baltimore and in that family prepared you for the career you've had?
Well, nothing probably, but I'm not prepared for it. But the truth is, when you grow up in a family that doesn't have a lot of wealth, you don't, commiserate with your friends and say, oh my God, I have friends that are wealthier. You just take your situation as you see it and do the best you can. So I didn't say, boy, I'm poor and there are other people that are wealthy and they have a better life. Just, do the best you can. And actually, in hindsight, as all of you know, if you grow up in let's say, a lower income family, lower middle class, it's a great advantage in the rest of your life. Growing up in a very wealthy family is, we can make jokes about it and so forth, but it's not as big an advantage as you think. As you probably all know, raising children when you're very wealthy is not an easy thing to do. And as Jackie Kennedy famously said, if you mess up raising your children, nothing else in life really matters. So all of you who have seen the problems of raising children, some of you no doubt know about it, if you have a lot of wealth, you often see kids who turn out not to be as motivated as you want. So I had the advantage, I didn't realize at the time, of knowing that if I was going to get anywhere in the world, I couldn't do it because my father, my mother did something for me necessarily other than give me unconditional love. They just basically said you have to do something on your own. So it's a great advantage. My children have done pretty well, but they know that there's probably some fallback where if they didn't do well, they're not going to be on the street. I didn't quite have that sense. So I'm very happy to have grown up in this situation that I did. And now I see that the irony of it is that sometimes people grew up in the wealthiest of circumstances and we're not, they're working for me, or they have positions that are subordinate to mine in some cases. It's a kind of strange thing that America produces, where you get people from modest circumstances sometimes becoming more prominent than people who came from the wealthiest of circumstances. So that's actually a good thing about our country.
There are a whole host of issues that are in the political ether today that you just alluded to: income inequality, labor mobility, kind of how you can get an education and move ahead in your life. If you look at Baltimore today, this weekend, Sunday New York Times Magazine has a cover story about Baltimore and how not only has it not improved like a lot of cities have with urbanization, but it's continued to deteriorate. How do you think about that?
Well, Baltimore, when I was growing up, was the 9th largest city in the United States. It's hard to believe, but it was a population of about 930,000 people. It's now probably about half of that. It was at the time a majority white city. It's now a majority minority city. But it was also strange in my circumstance. In the 1948, the United States Supreme Court in Shelley v. Kramer said restrictive covenants are against the law, against the Constitution, which meant you can't have a mortgage which says you can't sell to a person who's black or Jewish. Those kind of mortgages are very prominent in the United States. 1948, they were outlawed, but Baltimore never quite got the word. So in Baltimore, if you were black or Jewish, you couldn't buy a home in certain areas. So all the people who were Jewish, they had to build their homes or move in areas where there were already people who were Jewish. So I grew up in a Jewish ghetto, and I didn't know anybody who wasn't Jewish until I was about 13. I thought the whole world was Jewish. Then I realized not that many people are Jewish. But it was unusual circumstances. And the house I grew up in was very small. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm Abe Lincoln or anything, but these were 800...
Don't worry, we're not confused.
Right. These were 800 square foot homes. I went back and looked at them, 800 square feet. I was the only child. So these homes were all built for families that had one child. And when I wanted to show my son when he was 10 years old that I grew up in a smaller house than he was living in, I took him back to my house in Baltimore and I said, here it is. It was a row house. And he said, Dad, that's not so small. It's 10 doors. You had 10 doors in your house. I said, no, those are 10 houses. He didn't realize it, but these were very small houses. But in the end, it worked out okay. I went to a large public high school, which was, not so Jewish, and it was a different world. But I grew up in pretty much a Jewish ghetto, though I didn't emerge probably as Jewish as some people would like me to be.
So would your mother still have wanted you to be a dentist in retrospect?
My mother, look, all parents want their children to be happy. the happiness is the hardest thing in life to achieve, as we all know. You spend your whole life trying to figure out how to be happy, and my mother thought, what could be better? You know, my son could be a doctor, a lawyer, a dentist, but the dentist, she said, you get to be called a doctor, no weekend hours, and my mother was always spending time with the dentist, so she thought this was a good thing. I told her I might get arthritis in my fingers, and then what would I do? So I talked her out of that, fortunately.
Okay, good. So she was happy with the course you took.
Reasonably happy.
So Duke, University of Chicago Law School, academic distinction in both places. The next...
I would say okay. In other words, the truth is, if you go back and look, the people who are first in their class in all these great schools, you went to Harvard for 3 different schools, parts of Harvard, the people who are number one, you never know what actually happens to them. The people who actually succeed sometimes are people who were not the superstars. And that's just the strange thing of life. You go back and look at who was first in their class at Harvard or Yale or Princeton or Duke or Stanford, and very often they haven't achieved as much as you would have expected. I did an interview not long ago of Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos said that when he was at Princeton, he wanted to be a nuclear physicist, I think, and he thought he was pretty smart. And he got there and he realized there was some kid who was much smarter, and anytime they had a challenging question in the nuclear physics, they would go to this kid. And so after the interview was over, people were going on the internet saying, who was this kid? What happened to this kid who was so much smarter than Jeff Bezos? Well, he's running a 2-person consulting firm somewhere in Southern California. Obviously, Jeff Bezos did better.
Done a little bit better.
Bill Gates, Bill Gates went to Harvard, he thought he was a brilliant math person, but he realized there were people even better than him. Right. And the superstar math person was a person that Bill Gates hired to help him get Microsoft off the ground. He paid him $1,000, I think. And you kind of say to yourself, what happened to this person who was smarter than Bill Gates in math? Is he, changing the world? Well, no, he's a tax lawyer in New York City. So
what was his name?
I forget his name. I think it's
Monty Friedman.
Was it Hughes, Hubbard, and Reed?
He has the third person who has the original copyright on the first copy of MS-DOS.
So, I did okay in school, but not so great that people would say, this person is going to be brilliant, and I got lucky in many ways.
So you landed in the next part of your resume at the Carter White House. Domestic Deputy Policy Advisor, as Marie Joseph said, but one of the things that's always struck me is that group of people who you were with at that time period was an extraordinary group. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, what happened was I came to Paul Weiss, and I wanted to go to Paul Weiss because the man I idolized was Ted Sorensen. He was the greatest presidential speechwriter of all time. I was inspired when I was in the 6th grade to read and learn the great inaugural address of John Kennedy. My teacher went over it word for word. It was really poetry in prose form, 14 minutes. Spectacular speech, still stands the test of time as the greatest, I think, inaugural address of the 20th century. So I wanted to work for the man. I went to Paul Weiss. He didn't really need me to work for him, but I tried to do some things. And after a while, I came to the conclusion I wasn't that good a lawyer. And he came to the same conclusion. And my clients did as well. And so the advantage of knowing that you're not good at something early on is that you can try something else. Nobody has ever achieved anything great hating what they do. Nobody won a Nobel Prize hating what they do. These are people that love what they're doing. You don't do anything great 9 to 5. So I wasn't that good a lawyer. I didn't like it that much. I said, can you please get me a job so I could be like you, working in the White House and be an advisor to the President of the United States? And I didn't say this, but like coast the rest of my life on having been an advisor to the White House. I thought that was a good thing. But anyway, he got me a job with the man who said he'd be the next President of the United States. I joined his Senate staff. His name was Birch Bayh. Sadly, he died this morning. He was a very talented senator. He was running for president, but sometimes the most talented people don't get elected president. We have observed, and so he didn't get that far in the primaries. Jimmy Carter was doing better. Ultimately, there was an opportunity to work for Carter. I didn't know Carter from anything. I'd never been to Georgia practically. I got a job. I went down there, and as we have observed, people who work in White House staffs, often people work in the campaign, they're not the most qualified people because the most qualified people are probably not working in campaigns. But I got a job as the Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor when I was 27 years old. To be the advisor to the President of the United States. I wasn't qualified. I didn't think Carter was qualified. Though by today's standards, he's extremely qualified. He was governor of Georgia for 4 years, extremely qualified by today's standards. And so I did that for 4 years, and I loved it. Nothing like working in the White House when you're single, we have nothing else to do. It was great fun. And as you suggest, a lot of very good people worked in the White House staff who've gone on to do great things in the financial world and the academic world and other things. So we had a lot of young people who were very motivated to get a Democratic president in office again, and they just congregated together.
And so what were your key takeaways from that experience? What did you learn during that maybe briefer period than one expected in the White House, given the 1980 election, that you've taken with you through the rest of your life?
Well, there was a famous scriptwriter in Hollywood who wrote Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. His name was Bo Goldman, and he later wrote a book called Nobody Knows Anything, or Nobody Here Knows Anything, but meaning that nobody in Hollywood really knows what's going to make a hit movie. Well, nobody really knows anything in government either about what's really going to work, what's not going to work. But what I learned is that in government, if you're important in the private sector, it doesn't mean that much. You might have been a famous person in the private sector. You come in government, if your position is lower than somebody else's, you just don't have the power to do what you want to do. So many people who are very successful in the private sector don't succeed in government. Government is all about power, access to the decision maker. And I learned that in general, like most things in life, hard work probably pays off more than being brilliant. Being nice to people probably pays off more than being arrogant. Being able to figure out what motivates people probably pays off more than just ignoring what people's motivations might be. So I learned a lot, but I also learned that in the end, if you're going to accomplish something in the end in your life, you have to do it yourself, and you can't depend on somebody else to help you, or you can't just coast on somebody else's success. So if Carter had been successful, and maybe my career would have gone different. I thought Carter was going to win. And in fact, I never forget this. I said, "Dear God, please let us run against Ronald Reagan. He is an old man. How can anybody that old even run for president, get out of the bed in the morning?" Because he was 69 years old. I was then 31. Now I'm 69. I think 69 is like a teenager. But but then I didn't think. So be careful what you wish for, because we ran against Ronald Reagan and he clobbered us. We didn't realize, we underestimated how talented he was, what a good speaker he was, and Carter just really never cut up to being able to compete with him, and we had the hostages and the high inflation and gas lines and so forth. So some of you may have had this experience in life. I hope you have not, but in many ways I hope you have had this experience. And it's this. People came to me in the White House, you worked in government as well, you know. People come to you when you have power and they say, "You're brilliant, you're great, you're terrific," and sometimes you actually believe that maybe they know more than you know. But you realize you're not probably as good as they think, but they're flattering you. And so people come to you all the time and say, "You're great, by the way, can you help me this? Can you help me on that?" They said, "And by the way, if you ever want a job, call me up." I said, "Well, why would I want a job? I'm going to be in the second term of Carter, and I'll be the senior domestic advisor, so why would I need a job? But thank you for telling me to call you." Well, we lost the election. And when we lost the election, I started calling all these people saying, "Well, remember, I'm David Rubenstein, the bright young man you want to hire." No calls back. Nobody called you back. Because you're out of power in Washington, you're a dead man. As Harry Truman said, you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. So one day I'm riding around on Air Force One, Marine One, I'm going to Camp David, I'm advising the president, he's asking me, he's calling me for advice, and I'm 31 years old at that point, and the next day we lose the election, nobody calls me back, and so I hope none of you had this experience, but on the other hand, it may be character building. So I interviewed with a lot of law firms, and they didn't want anybody who didn't really know how to practice law, and being a Carter White House aide didn't exactly excite people. So I didn't want to tell my mother that her well-educated son, who turned down being a dentist, couldn't get a job. So January 20th comes, and I go to the inauguration, see Reagan inaugurated, and my mother said, where are you going to work? I said, "Well, I have so many offers from law firms, I don't know which one to take." January, February, March, April, May, no offers. And my mother said, "Well, just take one offer, just any firm." I said, "Well, I'm very picky. I don't want to go to the wrong firm." It took me to June to get some law firm to hire me again at the bottom. So I had to start all over again. And then once again, my client said, "You're not really that good a lawyer." And my partners reminded me that I wasn't that good a lawyer. So I had the advantage at a young age of knowing that I wasn't good at what I was trying to do. And so I was able to switch. If I'd waited until I was 50 to switch, it'd be harder. And I also had the advantage that I read two things that changed my life. Number one, I read that Bill Simon, who had been Secretary of the Treasury in the Ford years, he had done something called a leverage buyout. You know what a leverage buyout is. And he had done something buying Gibson greeting cards, and he more or less parlayed $1 million of personal investment into $80 million. And I said, in about 3 years, I said, "That's a better business than practicing law." I didn't know what a leverage buyout was, but I thought it'd be better than what I was doing. And then I went down the street to Bill Miller, who was Secretary of the Treasury in the Carter years, and said, "Your predecessor did a leverage buyout. You must know what a leverage buyout is. Why don't you do one? I'll do your legal work for you." Obviously, knowing my legal skills weren't that great, he didn't really bite at this. So I was thinking about starting the first leverage buyout firm myself, and I didn't really have the financial skills. And then I read that an entrepreneur will start his or her first company as an entrepreneur between the ages of 28 and 37. And after the age of 37, it's like a woman's biological time clock. Your chance of reproducing goes down after 37, your chance of starting a new company. And I read that when I was 37. So I said, uh-oh, I better start something. So I just cobbled together some people who knew more about finance, and I started the first firm in Washington that does this. And if we'd started in New York, people would have made fun of us because we didn't have the investment banking background or credibility. Nobody in Washington paid attention to us, and so we could make mistakes, and nobody really paid attention for a while. So the company took off. But if I hadn't read those two things, I might still be practicing law.
So you started in 1987?
1987.
Year of the great crash. That was a
We
pretty
started,
bold move.
and 3 weeks later, the market crashed, went down 508 points. We thought, geez, we're wiped out after 3 weeks, but we survived it.
So you had a very effective partnership, I always thought, observing your firm at Opportunity from the Inside. Talk about how you and your partners work together to build the firm.
Right. As all of you probably know, being married is complicated. You're married to one person for, whatever the number of years it might be. And a business relationship is like a marriage or a partnership. And being in business with somebody for another person for 32 years is not easy, but I've done it with two other partners. Two other partners and I more or less built the firm. And the way we were able to stay together is, one, we each had our area of expertise, so we didn't kind of get in the other person's sandbox. Secondly, we respected each other. Third, we didn't really fight with each other, and certainly not in front of anybody else. And fourth, we really felt we were doing something useful, and we kind of felt that sublimating our ego was probably better than just having fights and saying I'm more important than you. And so we kind of, it worked out, and I took on the role. I didn't have the finance background. So I said, all right, I don't have the finance background. What can I do to contribute to this partnership? Well, nobody wanted to go actually do the dirty work of raising the money. And so I would go out and sort of start begging for money and run around the world raising money. And the other guys didn't want to do that. So that was my contribution to some extent.
And in those early days, you engaged a few people to work with you. One notably was the former President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, Jim Baker, others. How did you use that as the strategic tool in your business?
In the early days, despite my enormous reputation as a White House advisor, nobody ever heard of me. So if I was calling up somebody and said, would you like to meet with David Rubenstein to hear about Carlyle, why you should invest, they would hang up, or they would say maybe, or not right now. So I didn't really have the ability to get in to see people of any prominence. So Frank Carlucci was stepping down as Secretary of Defense in the Reagan administration. He wasn't a lawyer. In those days, if you were not a lawyer, you couldn't affiliate with a law firm. So he was looking for some place to kind of be affiliated with in Washington where he could go on a lot of his corporate boards that he went on. Somebody recommended us. We talked to him. We said, fine. He joined us. And actually, he could call people and get them on the phone because he was Secretary of Defense. I couldn't get these people on the phone. So we helped us get deals, met with some investors. 4 years later, Jim Baker was available. I said, well, Frank Carlucci was good, but Jim Baker was even bigger. So I went to meet with him. I didn't know him. And I took him many months to convince him to join us. And then he said, can he bring along Dick Darman, who was his protege? And we said, okay. And so we had Carlucci and Baker and Darman. And then Jim Baker said, what about my friend George Herbert Walker Bush? I said, I've heard of him. I don't know him, but yeah, sure. He said, well, he's maybe be interested. So he joined as well. And then he said, what about my friend John Major? I said, okay, fine, have them all. So we had them all. And if you go to Kuwait with George Herbert Walker Bush, you can probably get to see anybody you want to see. So it was very helpful in getting in to see people. On the other hand, if you have a terrible track record, you don't know what you're doing, the meeting won't last that long. But we had a good track record, and getting the door was helpful. And we have dinners where I would invite people to hear Jim Baker or George Bush or John Major, and it kind of worked out. Then when George W. Bush was elected, it turned out that his father said, well, I don't think I can be in business anymore, so I'm going to step down. I said, okay. But then after a couple months, he said, well, I don't think it's such a big problem. I can be loosely affiliated. So he kind of still affiliated with us. And then when the Iraq War went south, we all of a sudden, because we had these people close to George W. Bush, we were blamed for it. And so it was an awkward situation because we had these prominent people and they were affiliated with us, and we're being blamed for the Iraq War. So we had to make an adjustment, and ultimately they all retired, and I recruited Lou Gerstner to be our chairman. And so I tried to change our image from being political, where we really weren't that political, but make it seem more like a business organization, and it kind of worked. But it was awkward because these were very good friends of mine, and George Herbert Walker Bush, I became very close to him, and he's one of I would say the nicest man I ever met in my life. Gracious, charming, fair, funny, and terrific. But in the end, we de-affiliated with a number of these people and to help improve the firm. But I kept good relationships with those people, but it was a little awkward at the time. And
you originally were identified with doing deals in and around the defense community.
Yes, because Frank Carlucci came in, so he was a former Secretary of Defense, and so we said, well, let's put it this way. Everett Dirksen, who was a Senate Minority Leader in the 1960s, famously brought the Republicans along for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. He famously said, when you're getting kicked out of town, get out in front and pretend you're leading a parade. Now, what does that mean? That means take advantage of the situation you find yourself in. So I found myself in Washington. People in New York didn't take us seriously. And so how could I say that people should invest with us? So I said, well, people in Washington, we understand companies more heavily affected by the federal government than the guys in New York. And it sounded good, it made sense, so we pretended that we were leading a parade by saying we understand heavily affected, industries are heavily affected by the federal government. So one of those was the aerospace defense industry. So interestingly, we bought a number of companies there, and then we found that a lot of people said, wait a second, you're buying companies in the defense industry. Yes, but they made it sound like it was the offense industry. And a lot of people didn't really like to invest in the defense industry. It became more complicated a while, and then the deals kind of dried up. There weren't as many of them. But we did make a number of investments in the aerospace industry and defense, and they worked out reasonably well, and that enabled us to have credibility to branch out into other areas.
Then you struck upon a strategy of going global when that wasn't the case in the business.
Yes.
Developing multiple asset classes when that wasn't the case, and that became a very unique strategy.
Yes.
You
Let me describe
Talk
that.
a little bit about that.
Private equity was essentially a mom and pop business. When Henry Kravis and his partners did the famous RJR deal in 1989, the biggest buyout ever done, they only had, I think, 7 investment professionals because they were small firms. They were very small. And why were they small? They were mom and pops. Why is that? Well, the partnership agreement said you can only have one partnership at a time. So if you're Henry Kravis, you have a buyout fund, you can't have another fund. You're supposed to spend 100% of your time doing that. So that was the rule we had as well. So Carlyle raised a $100 million fund, and then a light bulb went off in my head, and I said, you know what, why don't we try to build like a Fidelity or a T. Rowe Price or a Vanguard of private equity where we have many different funds, and we'll centralize fundraising, legal, tax, accounting in Washington, but we'll have a buyout fund, a venture fund, a real estate fund, and therefore take advantage of our brand name. That was a novel idea at the time. Now, they don't give Nobel Prizes in private equity, but that deserved a Nobel Prize, right? So this idea which contributed so much to society. So what we did is we basically built out a series of funds, and then the next thing we decided to do was to globalize it. Historically, if you were an American firm, you invest in America, European firm, Europe, Asia. We decided to hire local people in each of these jurisdictions and raise a fund around them, though we would control it. And so that's how we built out a multi-discipline, multi-country organization, and obviously other firms, Apollo, Blackstone, KKR, among others, have done the same.
Right. So not long after you de-affiliated with your first round of partners, we encountered the financial crisis. You famously saw it coming. In fact, I've got a quote here from you from Harvard Business School. David Rubenstein, I analogize private equity to sex. You realize there are certain things you shouldn't do, but the urge is there and you can't resist. Now, did you actually say that?
Well, I was speaking at Harvard Business School.
He didn't say no.
Let's put it in context. I was speaking at Harvard Business School. My daughter was a student there, and I think she invited me to speak.
So your daughter was in the audience for that?
My daughter and my son-in-law were in the audience. And I say, what kind of subject appeals to students? How can I, an older guy, make students think I'm really relevant? So I said, I make a sex analogy. And the analogy was that people ask me, I think, about bubbles. And I said, how do you know a bubble when you see it? And I said, you don't really know, but it's like sometimes you realize when you're investing in a bubble, it's maybe you shouldn't be doing it. You know you're at the top of the market, but you kind of can't resist the temptation. I said, not unlike sex. I mean, sometimes you can't resist the temptation, but maybe you know you shouldn't do something. So I thought it was a little bit of a joke, got a little joke. And then unfortunately, at the end, Reuters wrote a story afterwards. David Rubenstein says private equity is like sex, which isn't quite what I said, and I've been trying for the last 20 years to get it off my Wikipedia site. And I've learned something
not successfully.
Well, if you can't get something off your Wikipedia site, it's not that easy. I mean, I've been begging the founder of Wikipedia.
Jimmy Wales?
Jimmy. I say, how do I get this off? He says, well, it's not that easy. So it's still there. And
okay.
I think in my grave, by the time I'm dead, it'll still be there. But anyway, that was the genesis.
What did the private equity industry learn from the financial crisis?
Well, the serious lesson of the lessons of the financial crisis were these. One, if you have this, your company is going under, you have distress, don't panic, buy your debt back at a discount, because you can probably buy your debt back at a discount. So the greatest deals done in the time of the financial crisis were done by people that bought their own debt back at a discount. Apollo famously bought back their debt in one of the chemical deals. I think they made a $9 billion profit. Blackstone had a problem with Hilton. They probably needed to restructure the debt and put more equity in, but they turned out to make a $13 billion profit. So one, buy your own debt back at a discount, buy more equity at a discount, stay with the company, work with the banks, don't throw in the keys, because in the end, the world always comes back. So that was one of the lessons. Another lesson was probably don't leverage yourself up too much and therefore have more equity in the transaction. And probably treat your investors well and let them know what's going on, but also treat your bankers extremely well, because your bankers can decide whether they're going to pull the plug or not. So there were many lessons learned. I think one of the lessons we've all learned is that the world does come back, and if you're sensible in pricing something, you buy something reasonable at a reasonable price, and ultimately the economy goes against you, you can still make it work. Now, not every deal was saved, but many of the largest deals done at the time of the market decline actually turned out to be reasonable deals, not great, but reasonable.
So any echoes from that period in the situation we see today?
Today, we have recessions in the United States on average every 7 years since World War II. We're now 10 years into a growth cycle. So at some point, the economy may go down. I don't know when it will be, and I don't like to use the R word. When I worked in the White House, we had an inflation advisor named Fred Kahn, and he said publicly that we were going into a recession in 1980. Now, Carter called him into the Oval Office and said, look, I'm running for re-election. Don't use the R word. It scares people. And Fred Kahn said, what can I say? I believe this. He said, just don't use the R word. From then on, Fred Kahn would go out and say, I think we're heading into a banana. And he used the word banana instead of recession, and no reporter would want to say Carter's inflation advisor thinks we're heading into banana, so they kind of left him alone. I don't think we're heading into a banana necessarily, but at some point the economy will slow down. There's no evidence of it today, and I think probably we're in reasonable shape this year. I can't predict too far in advance, but at some point when the economy does slow down, we will probably have some companies in stress. What we've learned is if you buy the companies in stress at good discounts, you can make a fair amount of money. What the major change between the last time and this time is that before, when the Great Recession happened, about 30% of the debt in buyouts was so-called covenant light, which means it's hard to default on it. Now it's about 90%. So it's harder to default than it was before. We've also learned that other people are paying high prices now. It used to be before the Great Recession, you might buy a company for, let's say, 8 or 9 times cash flow. Now, I would say more typical is 13 or 14 times cash flow. So you're paying higher prices. Now, it's not as bad as it sounds because investors are willing to accept lower rates of return. Private equity basically got where it is by getting people net internal rates of return around 20%. Then it's gone down a bit now, but I'd say today most investors in private equity, if they can get 13, 14, 15% net returns after 3 or 4 years, are probably okay with that. And so you can pay a little bit more, prices can come down a bit, and you can still do okay.
So you're a famously successful investor. Can you explain why you declined to meet with Mark Zuckerberg?
Okay. My daughter was an undergraduate at Harvard and did not get in by athletic means, I should say.
Either way?
Right, she was not an athlete. My daughter was an undergraduate there, and she was dating a man she's now married to, and he knew I was in the business world, the investment world. So I guess he said, by the way, my classmate from Phillips Exeter, also my classmate at Harvard, is thinking of dropping out and starting a new company, and would you like to look at it? And I said, what does it do? He says, well, it brings college students together, kind of for help for dating or other stuff. I said, look, I've looked at these things before. All these dating companies, they never really make it in the end, so no, I don't really want to do this, meet with him. That was Mark Zuckerberg. He was looking for $10 million, as it turns out. That $10 million is today probably worth, I don't know, $100 billion or something. So I declined to meet with him, and that is one of my great regrets.
You've run, in the last couple of years, you've successfully run a succession process at Carlyle, and you've started your new family office, Declaration Capital. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, succession is a complicated thing. Nobody actually says, you know what, I can't do what I could do before as well as I used to do it, and I'm really ready to step back. That rarely happens. Sometimes it does. Lou Gerstner stepped down at 60 years old at IBM when he joined us. That was relatively young. But some people just don't want to step back. Warren Buffett is at 88, and he's doing a great job. He's still there. And clearly, if you're still working, it can, it can keep you alive. Hank Greenberg is like 92 or 93 and still going strong. But we decided that we wanted to step back when we were in our late 60s so people wouldn't say you're staying too long. I remembered that one firm had a well-known private equity firm. The founders that stayed here, there was, quote, 70, and they were criticized for that, and they lost some people who didn't want to wait for them to retire. So we decided we would make the transition. We picked 2 people to run it on the theory that we had 2 people running it day to day, and if 2 people were good enough to run it, we couldn't think anybody was good enough of 1 person to do it. In other words, we didn't think anybody was good enough to do what 2 people had done, so we wanted to have 2 people. But obviously it's hard to pick 1 person to do what 2 people did. So we had 2 people who were well qualified. They've been in the firm for a while. And we stepped back. We gave them the title co-CEO, and we gave ourselves the title of co-executive chair. And transition's always complicated because one day you're running the firm, the next day people are looking past you to say, well, thank you for getting me hired here. Thank you for helping make me some money. Now I don't care about you so much. I care about the other person. But it's life, and that's the way probably things should be. We're very happy with the people who brought in. They've done a very good job. They've done things that we didn't do. When you're a founder of an organization, you have a certain way of doing things, and that's how the organization grew. But necessarily, you don't do all the things that maybe second-generation people do. You won't fire some of the people that should be fired. You won't get into some areas you should get into. So we're happy we did it. I think that it's a transition we're happy with. I decided to start up a family office because I got tired of people asking me, David, do you have a family office? And I didn't have a family office. I had what I call family office envy. I didn't have any family office. Everybody's asking me, how come you don't have one? So I got tired of saying I don't have one, so I said, okay, I'll have a family office. So I decided to find some things that Carlyle doesn't do, so it wouldn't be a conflict with Carlyle. And I have set up a family office in New York, run by Brian Frank, who had been at Michael Dell's family office for quite some time. A very talented person, graduate of Harvard Business School, and we've hired a fair number of people, but we do things that Carlyle doesn't do, and we have to clear everything through Carlyle so there's no conflicts.
So you've brought the same level of zeal, global reach, and energy to your philanthropy as you have to your business. I'm going to quote you here. I try to remind people you don't need to be wealthy to be a philanthropist. You don't need to be wealthy to help your country. Philanthropy is an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. It doesn't say rich people writing checks. So you can give your time, your energy, your ideas, whatever it might be, you can be a great philanthropist. You've won the Carnegie Medal of Philanthropy, the David Rockefeller Award, an honor to win it. You're, in my view, one of America's great philanthropists of our generation. Tell us a little bit about your philosophy of philanthropy.
Well, when you grow up poor or lower income, you don't think about philanthropy. But when you make a fair amount of money, you can say to yourself, well, what are you going to do with the money? Now, here are the choices. You can do what the ancient pharaohs did and build pyramids and be buried with the wealth on the theory that you need it in the afterlife, but there's no evidence you really need this wealth in the afterlife, so probably being buried with it isn't a good idea. So I decided to eliminate that possibility. Another possibility is you can do what many people do. In fact, 99% of people do this. They don't give it away until they die, and they give it away when they die, I guess on the theory that there'll be somewhere where they can see it being given away by their executor or something. I wasn't sure I'd be where my executor, where I could see what my executor was doing. So I decided I would try to give back to society while I was alive. Then you do run the challenge of how much do you give to your children. Everybody always says, how much do you give, how much do you spoil your children with? And I just decided that I would prefer to probably give away the bulk of my money and not, quote, burden my children with the money, though they may not think that it's a big burden. But and so ultimately, Bill Gates called me at the time that my net worth was being publicized, and he said, would you join the Giving Pledge? And I understood what it was, and I said, okay. And so I did. And my theory is I got very lucky in life financially, and I want to give back to society. And like most of you who do things in philanthropy, and there are obviously some great philanthropists here in this audience, Marie-Jose being one of them, you realize that there's an infinite number of good things to do. So medical research is one thing that I try to do somewhat. Education is something I try to do. And 90% of my money actually goes into areas that isn't that well known, but I did one thing that got more attention than anything else, and that's something I've called patriotic philanthropy.
Right.
I bought the Magna Carta when I realized it was likely to leave the United States, the only copy in private hands. I kept it here, put it in the National Archives, and then I got in the habit of buying other historic documents and putting them in places where people could see them, on the theory that if they would see these documents, they might be inspired to learn more about our history. We don't teach history very much in American history in junior high school anymore. You can go to any college in the United States and graduate without having taken an American history course. You can major in history in 80% of the colleges and not have taken an American history course. And the result is that you get things like this. It turns out that when you ask American citizens what river did George Washington cross during the Revolutionary War, they say 30% the Rhine River. When you ask, which is not in our country, Americans who's the first Treasury Secretary, 30% will say Larry Summers. Recently a survey found that about 2/3 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. 2/3 of Americans cannot name the 3 branches of government. And 10% of college graduates thinks that Judge Judy is a member of the United States Supreme Court. So, which is not yet the case. So, so I've tried to get, my theory is that the human brain still works this way. If you see something on a computer slide on your computer, you might just go right past it. But if you take the time and trouble to go visit the original Magna Carta, you will maybe spend more time learning about it before you get there or learning about it afterwards. So it's one way to kind of help people learn more about history. A second thing is, when the Washington Monument had earthquake damage, I said to the head of the Park Service, how long is it going to take to fix it? He said, I don't know, I have to deal with Congress, it'll take for a long time. I said, I'll put up the money. And then I got in the habit of fixing other historic buildings, Mount Vernon, Montpelier with James Madison's home, Monticello, Arlington House at the Arlington Cemetery, Iwo Jima Memorial, so forth. And the theory was if you fix these places up, people will visit them more, maybe they'll learn about more about American history. I've also tried to educate members of Congress about American history. I started a program where I take a great historian and I interview them, Doris Kearns Goodwin, David McCullough, in front of members of Congress to educate them about American history. And I've been doing it for about 6 years now, and it's worked out well. Members of Congress, actually, they know a lot about history, but they always want to learn more. So I'm trying to, do something that I think is useful to society. I can do it while I'm alive and see the benefits of it. I don't have as much money as many of the most famous philanthropists. Bill Gates is a different league. If I had as much money as Bill Gates, maybe I'd do the same thing he's doing. Like all of you, if you had $100 billion and you didn't, it was given to you tomorrow, what would you do with it? Well, you buy a plane and a boat and a couple houses, but then you got 99.9 billion left. What are you going to do? Well, that's the problem that Bill Gates has, and he decided K-12 education in the United States and global health were things he was interested in, and maybe I would have made the same decision. I don't have as much money, so I picked things where I can start something that wasn't started before, finish something that wasn't going to get otherwise finished, that I'm likely to see the benefit of it in my lifetime, and that I have some intellectual connection to it that I want to stay involved. So one of the things I try to do is not just give money, but get involved in the board, stay involved, help with fundraising, or do more than just my money. And as you said in the quote you read, philanthropy is an ancient Greek word that means loving humanity. And many of the greatest philanthropists are people that don't have a lot of money, but they're doing great things for society. And I tell people consistently when I make speeches, think about what you're doing with your life. And what would you want people to think about what you've done on your very short time on the face of the earth? Humans, Homo sapiens, which is what we are, been around for about 400,000 years. The average life expectancy now in society, maybe in Western society, maybe 80 years, 85, something like that. So it's a relatively short time, 80 years out of 400,000. And so we're here for a short period of time. What can we actually do during this period of time to justify our existence on the face of the earth? And my theory is that if you give back to society and help other people, it's probably the most useful thing you can do. And also, selfishly, it makes you happy. Grumpy people are not as likely to live as long. Happy people live longer. And so David Rockefeller lived to be over 100 years old, great philanthropist. So my theory is that if you give to other people and help other people with money or your time, you'll be happier. Nobody says to themselves, I just was at a food kitchen today, served food to people, I hate myself for doing that. Or I gave some scholarships to poor kids today, I hate myself for doing that. They don't. They like themselves, and so selfishly, they say, maybe you could say you should do all these things just because it's likely to make you live longer. And also, there's probably a special place in heaven reserved for people that do these things. Now, I can't guarantee that, but why would you all want to take a chance that I'm not right? So, finally, a point on this is, remember this. There was a man named Alfred Nobel. We've referred to him earlier. He made the mistake of not having a private equity Nobel Prize. But other than that, he had one other problem in his life. in the late 1880s, his younger brother died. And the newspapers in Stockholm made a mistake. They thought that Alfred Nobel had died. And so they wrote a headline, said, Alfred Nobel, merchant of death, inventor of dynamite, has died. Thank God he's gone. Well, Alfred Nobel was sitting at the breakfast table reading that he died and didn't die. And so he realized that that was what people were going to say about him when he died, that he was a merchant of death. So obviously he came up with an idea of the Nobel Prizes. Think about what you would want
So
people
what
to...
exactly are you worried about then?
Well, I'm worried about many things, but what would all of you want to have written as your obituary? Suppose you could write your obituary tomorrow,
right,
and you could write it. What would you want to say? That you made a lot of money, or that you gave away a lot of money, and you helped other people, that you did something good for society? Presumably the latter is what you want to say, as opposed to just made a lot of money and had a lot of houses. So I tell people to think about what you want people to think about you as you get to the latter stages of your life. Now, many of you are much younger than me, so you're not thinking about the latter stages of your life, but I think people should think about what they can do to give back to society, and they'll be much happier, and I think they'll live longer for it.
Well done. This might seem in the light of that mundane, but I think it's interesting that you say you get about $50 million in requests per month.
Right.
And you don't have a staff.
That's correct.
So how do you sort your way through that?
Well, I don't have a staff because I'm afraid if I have a staff that they'll tell me that I should do this or that, and then I'll have to say to my staff, I'm not happy with what you recommend. Look, I know what I want to do, and like most people in life, most people like their own ideas better than other people's ideas, right? No, if you have your own idea, you kind of like it. So I kind of know what I want to do, and I just will go ahead and do it. So I thought I wanted to go see Monticello. I hadn't seen it in many, many years. I went down there. I thought they needed to fix it a bit, so I said, I'll give you some money to help fix it and do some other things. So I kind of have some ideas, and I can't really say that people come to me all the time with ideas, and I'm still very good ideas, but usually I'm more interested in my own ideas, and probably all of you are interested in your own ideas as well.
You mentioned Monticello. I was interested in something you said about the choice at Monticello to renovate the slave quarters.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that.
Well, Monticello, for those who don't know, was the home that was designed and built by Thomas Jefferson, and he loved it. It was his great pleasure in life. He didn't really want to depart from there to go live in the White House, but it was a plantation. He had many slaves. He had a very profitable business running a plantation with slaves, and he famously had a relationship with Sally Hemings, from whom it appears that he had at least 4 children that we know of. So I said that Monticello, I would like it to be rebuilt in many ways, but I'd like the slave quarters to be built out so that people can know that Thomas Jefferson, for all of his strengths, had some flaws, as many of the founding fathers did. And the same thing with Montpelier. I asked that the slave quarters be built out so people, when they visit, can see the good and bad. And I tell people that patriotic philanthropy, which I define it as reminding people the history of this country and the heritage, has to be the good and the bad. If we don't learn about the bad things, we're likely to repeat them. Now, a famous Harvard professor, George Santayana, said, those people who don't remember history are condemned to relive it. So if you don't want to learn about the bad things, you're probably going to relive some of those bad things. So learn about the bad things and realize how terrible slavery was and how even great people got caught up in tolerating it. And therefore, I want to remind people about it. And that's why one of the slave quarters will be built out at Monticello, and they are.
So what part of American history are we reliving today?
Are we reliving?
Yes.
Well,
because we failed to study it.
Today it's a situation where the United States is still, I think, the most admired nation in the world generally, and people want to come here, obviously, and it's a great chance for opportunity, but we have to recognize that we probably have a rival for global supremacy called China, and probably 50 years from today, because the population of China is bigger than ours, it may be difficult to be as dominant economy, as dominant military power, as dominant political power, but still it's a country of great opportunity and a country where you can come from modest circumstances and still rise up and become an important part of society. So I think it's the best place in the world to live, and obviously I'm privileged to be an American citizen, and as Warren Buffett has famously said, part of his success has been being an American and investing in the United States. So it's been a great place for all of us, I think, generally, and we do have to recognize that not everybody in our society has done as well. There are people at the bottom of our society who are not going to get to the top. When I was growing up, I believed in the American dream. You could work hard, get to the top. Many people in that bottom of our society don't believe that anymore, and they just given up. And one of the big problems, which is not talked about that much, is literacy. you can't really succeed in our society if you're not literate. You can't read. But 12% of Americans are functionally illiterate, meaning they can't read past the 4th grade level. And 80% of the people in our juvenile delinquency system are functionally illiterate. 2/3 of the people in the federal criminal system, prison system are functionally illiterate. We have to do a better job of getting people to actually read. If you can't read, you can't get very far in life. And I try to spend some time in that subject, but we've got to do much more to make our educational system work. We have the greatest university education system in the world. We're the most admired university system in the world. The K-12 is not in that category, and obviously Bill Gates and others are trying to spend time and money doing it. It's a big challenge in our country to bring the income inequality up and also the social mobility up. If I had the answers, I would be running for president. I don't have the answers, but it's obviously something we have to address.
So we're almost out of time. One last topic area I want to raise with you, which is another area that you've thrown yourself into with zeal and success, which is interviewing people. You've done it across a broad variety of platforms. You now have a TV show, which is great, really interesting. People in this room haven't seen it. I highly recommend it. So tell us why you do that, what interests you about it, what you're trying to accomplish.
Let me tell you how it came about. It wasn't something, I didn't grow up saying I want to be an interviewer, not that that's not a good thing to do. At Carlisle, we used to have prominent people come to our events for our annual meetings. Former presidents of the United States, former secretaries of state, former secretaries of treasury, and we pay them their going rate, which would be $100,000, $200,000, whatever it be. And they would give a speech, and then I could see a lot of people were not excited by the speech. Given all the money we pay, we wanted people to be more excited. And so I concluded that maybe I could make them more exciting if I would just interview them and ask some humorous questions as opposed to just serious things. Started doing that, then people said, I'm going to get the same fee, right? Yes, okay. I don't have to prepare a speech? Yes, you're just going to interview me? Yes. So I did that, and many of them were happy with it because they didn't have to prepare anything, and I would just ask them questions. And so I developed a little bit of a skill in it, and then Vernon Jordan asked me to succeed him as the president of the Economic Club of Washington. At the time, it had only had 100 members, and he said, you just get one business person a quarter. You get questions that come up from the audience after the business person's finished. You read the questions, that's it. So I started doing that. I realized most business people are not gifted public speakers, and the questions that came from the members honestly weren't so wonderful either. And so I would pretend I was reading questions from the audience, but I was making them up. And so the questions I was making were funny, people liked them. So I said, why don't I just junk that format and go to the interview process? So I went to the interview process, and then somebody from Bloomberg saw it and said, why don't you do it on TV? And so I enjoy it. It's my substitute for not playing golf. I don't play golf because I think if I have a meeting with somebody, they think you're competent and intelligent, I don't want to destroy the illusion of competence if I went on a golf course and the ball would go the wrong place. So I don't play golf. I know you're a very good golfer, but I can't do that. So I don't do that, and this is my substitute, and it's fun. I prepare for them, and I try to do it in a certain way, and people seem to like it, and it's fun.
David, 1 o'clock, time to stop. Thank you, not just for being here today, but for everything
you do.
Well, thank you for you're a special
preparing
guy.
so well. Thank you.
I guess
Well, thank you, Glenn and David. And David, you're obviously living by your own adage of doing things that make you happy.
Right.
And if we could make you happier and give you the Nobel Prize, we would, but it's beyond our control. So thank you, both of you.
Okay.
And thank everyone for being here. And I just want to remind you that we are not, the season isn't over. Our program continues. And April 3rd, we will have Raghrajan, who is the former governor of the Central Bank of India, with us. He's now a professor of finance at the Booth School of Business in Chicago. And April 11th, we will have Valdis Dombrovskis, who's the Vice President of the European Commission, and he will be discussing Brexit. And of course, we are going to continue our endeavor with women in corporate leadership. We had, and I want to thank many of you who were there on Monday with our group of women investors. So we will continue with a reception and panel on April 16 discussing diversity in media and how news outlets are confronting gender representation. So please mark your calendars, enjoy lunch, and again, thank you to David and Glenn.
Thank you.